Welcome to the Valmika Property Investing Podcast. I'm JP, your host and the founder of Valmika Buyers Agency. With my background in investment banking, I'm here to share Wall Street tips and secrets for building a top 4% property portfolio. Let's dive into the world of property investment together. This week's episode is titled The Importance of Yield in Property. I'm going to break it down into a few categories. Firstly, I'm going to speak to you about understanding yield. Then I'm going to move on to determining the deal breaker yield level. And then lastly, I'll speak about the significance of yield in commercial versus residential property. So let's get straight into it. Understanding yield. Yield in property is a very important metric to consider before pulling the trigger on whether it's a viable investment or not. So yield in simple terms is the annual rent divided by the price that you paid for the property. Obviously, you get your gross yield, which doesn't take into account any outgoings or deductibles. And that yield will obviously be higher when compared to your net yield. But for simplicity, let's keep to gross yield for this topic. So when you move into property, and whether this be residential or commercial property, yield is a very important metric to consider. And it can actually help you determine whether the property will be a good deal to invest in or good property to invest in or not. And yield is more important when it comes to commercial property than residential property. And I'll explain that a little bit later. But for now, let's just talk about yield in a general sense. So when you've done your research on an area or on a commercial property and you decide to look into the investment, yield is a very important measure of whether the property is worthwhile to invest in or not. So let's take a few examples. When you look at yield, you must compare it to two main metrics. Number one is inflation. Number two is your debt yield. So in other words, the cost of your debt. So let's analyze the inflation level. So if inflation, for example, we take inflation in city, which was roughly around, say, 5%, let's use that as a round level. And if you're looking at investing in a property that's a 3% yield, you are actually losing money because your capital is eroding away at a 5% because of inflation, but you're only getting 3% return on the property. So that is a red flag. So it's important to invest in a property that has what we call real returns. Real return is the difference in the actual yield on the property when compared to inflation. So let's take another example. If the yield on a property is 6% and inflation is 5%, you've got a real return of 1%. So your capital is growing at 1% because that's the rest of the 5% is the erosion due to inflation. So inflation is a very, very important metric to compare your yield against. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't purchase a property that has got a yield lower than inflation. It just means that if you do, you're relying more on capital growth. So the capital uplift that the property will be generating due to its demand metrics. And those demand metrics are different when it comes to residential property versus commercial, but we'll go into that next. All right, so that is inflation. The second important metric to measure your yield on your property against is your debt yield. In previous episodes, I've always spoken about your positive delta. Now, delta is the difference between your property yield and your debt yield, so the cost of your debt. So if your debt is 6% and your property yield is 3%, then it's got a negative delta. So that's like having a partner who's demanding more of a return than what the actual property is giving you. So it's eating away at your equity. then again, doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest in the property. It just means that you're going to be relying on capital growth if you've got yield, a property yield that is lower than your debt yield. So if you've got a negative delta. If you've got a positive delta, then that would imply that you've got a very cheap partner in the debt in the bank, only requiring a debt yield of 6%. And if the property yield is 8%, it means they're giving you the majority of the capital to invest in the property and only wanting a smaller portion of the yield metrics of their property. And that's a positive delta. And that's what gives you a significant uplift, which I've explained in previous podcasts. Now comes the crucial element. Now I want to speak about the difference in comparing yield of a commercial property versus a residential property. Commercial property is all about yield. The demand supply metrics of a commercial property are very closely linked to yield. However, in a residential property, it's got other metrics that don't, or other demand supply metrics that are different to commercial property. And I'll explain what I mean. So in residential property, let's take an example with Australia, and let's take Sydney. Australia's had 600,000 people immigrating this past year. That has created a huge demand base. And because of the demand base, that's pushed property prices higher. It also has pushed rentals higher. However, your yields in Sydney, because of this demand, are only sitting around the 3 to 2% level in some suburbs. But it's still a viable investment because that demand is increasing and the supply is not keeping up with the demand. So the capital growth element is large. So you don't have to rely on yield to get a return on your property investment because you were getting that natural demand element outstripping the supply. So you'll get an economic uplift in your property. However, with commercial property, it doesn't work that way because people need a place to live, but they have a choice of where to invest in their commercial property. So their yield becomes more important. So I wouldn't recommend investing in a commercial property that has negative real yields. So in other words, it's got a yield that is lower than inflation. And I wouldn't recommend investing in a commercial property that's got a negative delta. So in other words, the yield is lower than your debt yield, because then it's basically eroding wealth. So yield is a much more important driver for these reasons in commercial property than in residential property. I hope that made sense, and I hope it will help you in your future investment journey. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Valmika Property Investing Podcast. If you're interested in our services, please visit us at valmikaproperty.com. Remember, the content shared in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. For personalized financial advice, always consult your trusted financial advisor or professional. See you in the next episode.